The wind roared outside, slamming against the small windows of a modest home at the edge of town. Rain poured down like someone had ripped the sky open, and the sound of thunder shook the walls. Inside, a single father sat on the couch, his head leaning back against the cushions as he listened to the storm. His daughter was already asleep in her small bedroom, wrapped in a warm blanket with her favorite stuffed animal. He was exhausted, but grateful for the roof over their heads. It wasn't much, this little house, but it was theirs. He was just about to turn off the TV and head to bed when he heard it, a knock. At first, he thought he imagined it. No one comes knocking during a storm like this. The wind rattled the door, and he stayed frozen for a second, his heart beating a little faster. Then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. He stood up slowly, cautious. It was nearly midnight. He glanced toward his daughter's bedroom door, making sure she was still asleep, then walked quietly to the front door. His hand hesitated on the handle. Out here, in this part of town, visitors were rare. And in weather like this? Almost impossible. He opened the door a crack, and the sight made him pause. Standing there, drenched from head to toe, was a woman. She looked completely out of place. Her wet hair clung to her face, her jacket soaked through, and her shoes, which were clearly expensive, were covered in mud. She was shivering badly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice shaking. My car broke down, and my phone died. I didn't know where else to go. Could I just come in for a little while? Please. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. She looked terrified, like she'd been out there for a long time. His first instinct was to protect his daughter, but something in the woman's eyes told him she wasn't a threat. She looked desperate. Yeah, come in, he said, stepping aside. She hurried inside, clutching her soaked bag against her chest. The warmth of the small home seemed to bring some color back to her face, but she was still shivering. He quickly grabbed a towel from the closet and handed it to her. She whispered a soft thank you, her voice barely audible over the wind. You're freezing, he said. Sit down. I'll get you something warm. She nodded, sinking onto the edge of the couch. He walked into the kitchen, boiled some water, and made her a cup of tea. As he stirred and shook her, he glanced toward her again. She sat there quietly, trying to dry her hair with the towel. Her clothes clung to her, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. He handed her the tea, and she wrapped her hands around it like it was the only source of warmth she had left. She took a slow sip, her hands still shaking. Thank you, she murmured. I don't usually. Her words trailed off, like she wasn't used to being this vulnerable. He sat across from her, studying her for a moment. You're lucky I was still awake, he said with a small smile, trying to lighten the mood. Storm like this, I'm surprised you made it to my door. She let out a shaky laugh, her eyes flickering with exhaustion. Me too. My car stopped working a mile back. I just started walking. He frowned. A mile? In this weather? That's dangerous. She shrugged weakly. I didn't have a choice. There was silence for a while, only the sound of rain hammering against the roof. He could see she was nervous, her shoulders tense even as she sipped the tea. She looked around his living room, the old couch, the small bookshelf with a few children's books, the simple pictures on the wall. She seemed out of place here, like she came from a completely different world. He finally asked, What were you doing out this late? She hesitated, looking down into her cup. Work, she said softly. I had a meeting, it ran late. Something about her made him curious. Her clothes were elegant, but now ruined by the rain. Her watch looked expensive, and even though she was soaked, she had a certain grace about her. Work must be important if you're out driving this late in a storm, he said carefully. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but guarded. It is, she said simply, then gave a faint smile. But tonight, I guess it wasn't worth it. He nodded slowly, respecting her privacy. He didn't want to pry too much. She was clearly shaken. The house creaked as a strong gust of wind rattled the windows. From the hallway, a small voice called out, Daddy? He turned his head, quickly. His daughter was standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bear, her hair messy from sleep. She looked at the stranger on their couch, blinking curiously. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "It's okay. Go back to bed." But she didn't move. "Who's that lady?" she asked softly. The woman's lips curled into a warm smile, despite how tired she looked. "Hi," she said gently. "This lady just needed a safe place from a storm," he told his daughter. "She's a guest for tonight." The little girl nodded sleepily, still curious, but eventually shuffled back to her room. He turned back to the woman. "Sorry about that." She shook her head. "She's sweet," she said softly. Her voice cracked a little, and she quickly looked down at her tea. He didn't press her. He could tell she was holding something back, pain, exhaustion, maybe even fear. He thought about asking more questions, but the way she sat there, clutching the cup like it was her lifeline, told him she needed quiet more than anything. "I can set up the guest room for you," he said after a moment. "It's not much, but it's warm." Her eyes filled with relief, and she nodded. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." He stood, grabbed some extra blankets, and led her to the small guest room. She paused at the doorway, turning to look at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he saw something in hers, gratitude, yes, but also sadness. Deep sadness, like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," he replied softly. He walked back to the living room, turning off the lights as the storm continued outside. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had appeared on his doorstep, drenched and trembling. There was something about her that didn't add up, something more than just a car breaking down. But for now, she was safe. And in this small house, with the storm raging on, that was all that mattered. The next morning came quietly. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, and the storm clouds still hung low in the sky. The world outside was soaked, leaves scattered across the yard, and puddles glistened in the dim morning light. Inside the little house, it smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. He stood by the kitchen counter, quietly making breakfast. His daughter sat at the table, swinging her legs as she colored in her little notebook. The house felt calm again, but there was an unfamiliar energy lingering in the air, the presence of a stranger in their home. The guest room door creaked softly, and she appeared. Her clothes were neatly folded over her arm, though still damp from last night's storm. She looked different now, with her hair brushed and tied back, and though there were faint shadows under her eyes, her face was calm. She offered a small, polite smile. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still carrying a hint of exhaustion. "Morning," he replied, nodding. "Did you get some rest?" She gave a slight laugh, though it was tired. "More than I expected to. Thank you for everything last night. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't opened the door." He waved off her thanks with a small shrug. "Anyone would have done the same. Can I get you some coffee?" She hesitated, but then nodded. "Yes, please." As he poured her a cup, she stepped further into the kitchen, glancing around the cozy space. The walls were decorated with his daughter's drawings and a few family photos, a much younger version of him holding his baby girl, smiling in a way that felt almost like a different lifetime. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at the pictures, but she didn't say anything. The little girl peeked up from her coloring book and whispered, "Hi," shyly. "Hi," the woman said with a warm smile. "You must be his daughter." The little girl nodded. "What's your name?" The woman froze for a brief second, as if caught off guard, then smiled again and introduced herself simply. She knelt down to the girl's level, her expensive jewelry catching the light. "You're very lucky to have such a nice dad," she said softly. The girl's cheeks turned pink, and she giggled, hiding her face behind her coloring book. He watched the interaction quietly, noticing how gentle the woman was with his daughter. It was surprising. Something about her, her posture, her clothes, her perfectly polished nails, screamed that she wasn't used to being in places like this. But her tone with his daughter was warm and sincere. She sat at the table, wrapping her hands around the warm mug he handed her. "This place is peaceful," she said softly. "Quiet. I haven't been somewhere like this in a long time." "It's nothing fancy," he replied with a small smile. "But it's home." She nodded, taking a slow sip of the coffee. For a moment, there was silence, just the soft clinking of a spoon in a cup and the faint scribbling of crayons on paper. Then she spoke again, her voice lower this time. I know I didn't explain much last night. Well, I guess you could say I was scared. I've had a long couple of months. He looked at her carefully. She seemed guarded, like she'd built a wall around herself. You don't have to explain anything, he said gently. You were caught in a storm. That's all that matters. But she shook her head slightly, as if feeling the need to say more. I'm not someone who usually asks for help. I don't, she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. I'm in charge of a company. I'm the one who's supposed to have all the answers, who's supposed to fix things. But last night, I felt completely powerless. I didn't even know where I was walking. He blinked, surprised. A company? She didn't look like someone who ran a small shop or a family business. There was something about her presence, her confidence, despite her exhaustion, that told him she was someone used to making big decisions. That's a lot of responsibility, he said after a pause. She let out a short laugh. That's one way to put it. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Well, for what it's worth, you seem pretty strong to me. Walking through a storm like that, most people wouldn't have made it this far. For the first time since she arrived, her smile reached her eyes. It was small, but it softened her whole face. Strong, she repeated quietly, almost like she was testing the word. That's not how I've been feeling lately. The little girl looked up from her drawing suddenly and said, You can stay if you want. The woman turned to her, touched by the innocence in her voice. That's very kind of you, she said softly. But I can't stay forever. The little girl frowned, but her father gave her a gentle look, silently telling her to be polite. Breakfast passed with soft conversation. The woman asked the little girl about her drawings, and the girl proudly explained each picture. The storm outside had finally stopped, and pale sunlight began streaming through the window. After eating, he offered her a clean sweatshirt to wear while her clothes dried by the heater. She accepted, slipping it on, and he noticed how it dwarfed her frame. She sat on the couch, holding her coffee cup with both hands, her expression distant as she stared out the window. You seem like you've had a rough time, he said gently. She blinked, pulled out of her thoughts. I have. But last night, sitting here, I felt safe. I can't remember the last time I felt that way. There was something in her voice that made him pause. He wanted to ask more, but she quickly changed the subject, asking about his life. He told her about raising his daughter alone, about losing his wife years ago in an accident. She listened intently, her eyes soft with understanding. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That must have been so hard. He nodded slowly. It was. But she's my whole world, he said, glancing at his daughter, who was now humming softly to herself as she colored. I promised her I'd do my best. That's all I can do. The woman's expression grew distant again, like she was remembering something from her own life. I wish I had that kind of clarity, she murmured, knowing what matters most. You'll figure it out, he said softly. Sometimes it just takes a storm to remind us. She looked at him, startled by his words, and for a moment their eyes held. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but powerful. Eventually, she excused herself to freshen up, and he watched her walk down the hallway. Something about her seemed fragile, like she was carrying a weight no one else could see. As he cleared the breakfast table, he found himself wondering who she really was, not just her title or her polished appearance, but the person behind it all. Something told him there was a story there, one he hadn't even begun to uncover. And deep down, he had a strange feeling this was only the beginning. The rest of the morning passed quietly. The house was calm, filled with the soft hum of a heater and the distant sound of water dripping outside. She returned from the guest room, wearing the oversized sweatshirt he had lent her. It hung loosely on her frame, and her wet clothes were neatly folded in her hands, still drying near the heater. She looked different now, less guarded, more at ease, though her eyes still carried a quiet sadness. His daughter ran up to her with a crayon drawing clutched in her tiny hands. I made this for you, she said shyly. The woman knelt down, smiling warmly. For me? The little girl nodded eagerly. It's you. And that's Daddy. And that's me. She showed her the picture, a shaky drawing of 3 stick figures standing under a big yellow sun, smiling. The woman's eyes softened as she took the paper carefully, like it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep this forever." The little girl beamed and skipped off to her coloring book again, leaving the woman holding the drawing with trembling fingers. She turned away slightly, blinking back tears. He noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he poured her another cup of coffee and handed it to her. "You're good with kids," he said softly. She smiled faintly, taking the cup. "I don't get to be around them much." He raised an eyebrow. "No family." She shook her head. "Not really. I grew up with my grandparents, but they passed away years ago. I don't have siblings, and my parents weren't really in the picture." She took a sip of coffee, her gaze fixed on the window, where raindrops streaked down the glass. "I guess that's why I buried myself in work. I didn't really have anyone else." He leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "And now you run a company." She nodded slowly, as if it wasn't something she liked to talk about. "Yes, a big one. People think it's glamorous, but," she trailed off, shaking her head. "It's lonely. Every decision is on your shoulders, every mistake is your fault, and every success just raises expectations higher. Sometimes I wonder if I even know who I am anymore." He didn't say anything right away. She was opening up, and he didn't want to interrupt. "I built my whole life around being strong," she continued softly. "But last night, walking in that storm, completely lost. I felt so small." There was a vulnerability in her voice that made him pause. He walked over and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "Everyone feels small sometimes," he said gently. "Even the strongest people." She gave him a faint, tired smile. "You don't strike me as someone who feels small." He chuckled softly. "I'm a single dad. Trust me, I've had plenty of moments where I felt like I wasn't enough. I still do. Every day." She tilted her head, curious. "How do you do it? Raising her on your own, I mean." He glanced toward his daughter, who was now humming to herself while she drew. A soft smile spread across his face. "You just figure it out. I lost my wife when Lily was 2. It was sudden, and I felt like my whole world collapsed. But I had this little person who needed me. So I learned. I cooked. I cleaned. I worked 2 jobs. I made mistakes. A lot of them. But somehow we got through it. She's my reason for everything." The woman's expression softened, and she looked at him with admiration. "You're stronger than you think." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I'm just a dad trying to do right by his kid." For a moment, there was silence, and the rain outside grew lighter. She stared into her cup, her mind far away. "I don't think I've ever had that," she whispered. "What do you mean?" he asked gently. "That kind of love, where someone looks at you like you're their whole world. I've always been alone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly looked away, blinking rapidly. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he stayed still, sensing she wasn't ready for that. Instead, he said quietly, "You don't have to be alone. Not forever." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, like she wasn't sure if she could believe him. His daughter interrupted the moment by running over and tugging on his sleeve. "Daddy, can we play a game?" He smiled and ruffled her hair. "Sure, sweetheart. Let's set up the board." The 3 of them ended up sitting on the living room floor, playing a simple board game. At first, the woman just watched, but soon she was laughing softly as the little girl insisted on bending the rules to win. It was a simple scene, a father, his daughter, and a stranger brought together by a storm, but it felt warm, almost like family. He glanced at the woman, and for the first time, she looked relaxed. Her shoulders weren't tense anymore, and she was smiling, a real smile, not the polite, guarded one she'd worn before. When the game ended, the little girl curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket, sleepy from all the excitement. The woman helped tuck her in, smoothing her hair gently. "She's wonderful," she said softly as they stepped back into the kitchen. "She's my whole life," he replied. There was a pause as they stood there, leaning against opposite counters. The air between them felt different now, not just strangers, but 2 people who understood loneliness in their own ways. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice soft but sincere. "For what?" he asked. "For last night. For this morning. for being kind. I don't get that very often. Most people want something from me, or they're scared of me because of my position." He shook his head. "Here, you're just a person who needed help. That's all." She smiled faintly, but her eyes looked glassy again. "It's been a long time since I felt like just a person." He watched her for a moment, sensing the heaviness she carried. He didn't know her full story yet, but he could tell she was someone who'd been running for a long time, from expectations, from pain, maybe even from herself. As night began to fall again, the rain finally stopped, leaving the world outside glistening and quiet. The house felt warm and safe, and for a while she stayed in the living room, helping him tidy up and talking softly about little things. Nothing about work, nothing about titles, just simple conversation. Later, when he glanced at her sitting on the couch, smiling faintly at a photo of him and his daughter, he had a strange feeling. This wasn't just a random encounter. Something about her being here felt meant to be. Like life had brought her to his doorstep for a reason neither of them could see yet. And deep down, he sensed this was only the start of something much bigger, though he had no idea just how much their worlds were about to change. The next morning felt different. The storm that had rattled the house for 2 days was finally gone, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden stripes across the floorboards. The smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of pancakes sizzling in the pan. He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, flipping pancakes, while humming softly under his breath. His daughter sat at the table, her small hands busy arranging napkins and forks like she was preparing for a grand feast. There was a warmth in the house that morning, a kind of peace that didn't come often. The woman stepped into the kitchen, wearing the same sweatshirt from yesterday, though now it looked almost like it belonged to her. Her hair was neatly brushed, falling softly over her shoulders, and her face, though still tired, seemed calmer. She paused at the doorway, watching the father and daughter for a moment, with a faint smile. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice gentle. The little girl looked up and grinned. "Good morning," she chirped. He glanced back at her, smiling. "Morning. Sleep well?" She nodded, stepping inside. "Better than I have in weeks." "Thank you." He poured her a cup of coffee and gestured for her to sit. She slid into the chair next to his daughter, who was now carefully pouring syrup onto her pancakes with intense focus. The woman chuckled softly. "You're quite the chef," she said to the little girl. The girl giggled. "Daddy makes the best pancakes." The woman looked up at him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "I believe it." They ate together at the small table, the sound of forks and soft conversation filling the room. The woman seemed to relax even more, laughing at the little girl's stories and asking questions about her favorite cartoons. It was simple, domestic, and warm. After breakfast, the girl begged the woman to help her build a fort in the living room. The two of them draped blankets over chairs, piling pillows into a cozy little hideout. Laughter echoed through the house, something it hadn't heard in a long time. He stood back, watching them, his heart unexpectedly full. When the fort was finished, the woman crawled inside with the girl, both of them giggling like old friends. She looked up at him with a playful smile. "You're welcome to join us, you know." He shook his head, grinning. "I think I'll let you two enjoy it." Hours passed easily. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air outside crisp and fresh. The woman borrowed his daughter's crayons and started sketching alongside her, their heads bent together in concentration. He couldn't help but notice how naturally she fit in, as if she'd been part of their lives forever. Later in the afternoon, she helped him in the kitchen again, chopping vegetables for dinner. She seemed comfortable here, standing barefoot by the counter, humming softly as she worked. He found himself stealing glances at her, noticing the way her expression softened when she was focused on something simple, like slicing carrots or folding a dish towel. "This is nice," she said quietly, breaking the silence. He looked up from the pot he was stirring. "What is?" She smiled faintly. "All of this. Being here. It's peaceful." He nodded slowly. "It is. That's why I never left this place. It's small, but it's home." She leaned against the counter, holding a glass of water in her hands. "You're lucky." I don't really have a home like this." He tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I have a penthouse apartment in the city. It's beautiful, expensive, but it doesn't feel like home. It's just a place I sleep. Half the time, I'm not even there. I'm always working, always running. I don't remember the last time I cooked a meal for myself, let alone sat down at a table with someone." He studied her for a moment. "That sounds lonely." She let out a soft laugh, but it wasn't a happy one. "It is." He didn't push further. He could see the weight she carried in her posture, in her words. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about how he learned to cook after his wife passed away, out of necessity more than anything. She listened intently, smiling softly as he described burning his first few meals and how his daughter became his taste tester. That evening, they all sat down for dinner together, the little girl chattering excitedly between bites. The woman laughed at her stories, genuinely laughing, not the polite chuckle she'd given him when they first met. There was warmth in her eyes now, a softness that hadn't been there before. After dinner, the girl curled up on the couch with a blanket, dozing off as a children's movie played quietly on the TV. The woman helped him clean up the dishes, and when they finished, they both sat in the living room, speaking in hushed tones so they wouldn't wake the little one. "This is different for me," she said softly, her gaze on the sleeping child. "I'm used to late nights in boardrooms, endless calls, and a schedule that doesn't let me breathe. But here, it feels like time slowed down." He nodded. "That's what I love about this house. Life's simple here. No one expects anything from me except to be a good dad." She glanced at him, her eyes thoughtful. "You are. She's lucky to have you." He smiled faintly. "I'm the lucky one." For a long moment, they sat in silence, just listening to the soft sound of rainwater dripping from the roof outside. There was a sense of calm between them, like they'd known each other for much longer than a single night. When it grew late, he offered to drive her home, now that the weather had cleared, but she shook her head gently. "I'm not ready to leave yet," she said softly. He didn't argue. Something in her voice told him she needed this break from her world, this little slice of peace. That night, she stayed in the guest room again. Before going to bed, she paused at the doorway, looking back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for making me feel safe." He met her gaze, sensing the sincerity in her words. "You're welcome," he said simply. As she closed the door, he sat on the couch, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 days. A stranger had shown up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm, and somehow, she already felt like someone who belonged in their little world. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull toward her, a sense that she wasn't just passing through. Upstairs, she sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the crayon drawing his daughter had given her earlier. She traced the lines with her finger, smiling faintly, though her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. For the first time in years, she felt like she was somewhere she could truly breathe. Neither of them knew it yet, but these quiet moments would soon become memories they'd hold onto forever. Because life was about to change for both of them in ways they couldn't imagine. The days after she left felt strangely quiet. The house was the same. His daughter's laughter still filled the rooms, the smell of coffee still lingered in the mornings, and the same creak in the hallway floorboard reminded him to step carefully. But something felt missing. Her absence was like an echo, a shadow that lingered in every corner. She had left with a soft smile and a polite thank you, promising she'd stay in touch. She handed him a sleek business card with her name printed in elegant letters and drove off in a car sent by someone from her office. He had watched from a porch as the car disappeared down the road, a small ache in his chest he couldn't quite explain. Life returned to normal, or at least it was supposed to. He went back to work, juggling shifts and school drop-offs, late-night grocery runs, and bedtime stories. But in the quiet moments, when the house settled for the night and his daughter was fast asleep, his thoughts drifted back to her. He remembered the way she had smiled at his little girl, the sound of her laugh when they'd built that blanket fort, the way her expression softened when she'd finally felt safe. It was just a few days later that he saw her face again, not in person, but on a screen. He was flipping through the news on his phone during a lunch break when her photo appeared in a headline. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Her name was bold, her picture polished and professional, but the story beneath it was anything but. CEO under investigation for fraud allegations, the headline read. He stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over, convinced he'd misunderstood. The article went on to describe financial scandals, accusations of corruption, and whispers of betrayal within her company. It painted her as cold and ruthless, a woman who had everything and destroyed anyone who got in her way. But that wasn't the woman he'd met. He remembered her kneeling on the floor, helping his daughter draw silly pictures. He remembered her soft voice when she'd said she hadn't felt safe in a long time. He remembered the sadness in her eyes, a sadness no article could capture. He tried searching for more, scrolling through pages of gossip articles, stock market reactions, and public outrage. The world seemed to be tearing her apart piece by piece. That night, he sat at the kitchen table long after his daughter had gone to bed, her business card lying in front of him. He turned it over in his hands, debating whether to call. Would she even want to hear from him? Was she okay? He dialed the number once, but hung up before it even rang. He tried again the next morning, but the line was disconnected. Her email bounced back. It was like she had disappeared overnight. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had only known her for 2 days, but something about her had left a mark on him. He couldn't shake the image of her walking through the storm, soaked and trembling, seeking shelter not just from the weather, but maybe from the weight of her life. A week passed. Then, too, life carried on. But every time he tucked his daughter into bed, every time he saw the crayoned drawing she had left behind, carefully pinned to the fridge, he felt that ache again. One rainy evening, his daughter climbed into his lap as he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the muted television. "Daddy," she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we going to see her again?" He froze. She didn't say her name, but he knew exactly who she meant. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "She was nice," his daughter said. "She smiled a lot, but her eyes were sad." He looked down at his little girl, surprised by her words. She was only 6, but she had noticed it too, that sadness the woman had tried so hard to hide. He hugged his daughter close, his throat tight. "Yeah," he whispered. She was sad. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm outside reminded him of that first night, the knock at the door, the trembling voice asking for shelter. He wondered where she was now. Was she safe? Was she alone? Did she know that somewhere out here a little girl missed her and a man who barely knew her couldn't stop thinking about her? A few days later, he came home from work to find a small envelope sitting on his doorstep. There was no return address, no postage. Just his name, written in neat handwriting. He felt a chill run down his spine as he picked it up and stepped inside, setting his bag down carefully. His daughter was in her room playing with her dolls, humming softly to herself. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for a long time before he finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting was neat but shaky, as if her hands had trembled while she wrote it. "Thank you for that night. It was the first time in years I felt safe. I'm sorry for everything. Please take care of your little girl. She's lucky to have you." His chest tightened as he read the words again and again. It felt like a goodbye. There was something else tucked inside, a small photograph. It was of her, smiling softly with his daughter from that morning they'd all had breakfast together. His daughter's arms were wrapped around her, and the woman's face, though tired, looked genuinely happy. His hands shook as he held the picture. A deep sense of dread washed over him. He knew instinctively something was wrong. The news confirmed it the next day. Her body had been found in her apartment. The reports called it an apparent suicide, blaming the pressure of the investigation and public humiliation. But he knew better. It wasn't just the headlines or the scandal. She had been carrying that sadness long before the world turned against her. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed, the letter and photograph in his lap. His daughter wandered in, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Daddy," she whispered. He quickly wiped his tears and forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart." She climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. "I miss her," she said softly. He swallowed hard, hugging her tightly. Me too, he whispered. They sat in silence, the soft hum of the rain filling the room. He stared at the photo again, tears sliding down his cheeks. He wished he'd said more, done more, been more. She had been more than a stranger at his door. She had been someone searching for a safe place, for kindness, for peace. And in some small way, maybe he had given her that, if only for a night. The days that followed felt heavier than the storm that had brought her to their doorstep. News outlets filled their screens with her name, her face, and endless speculation about her life. They talked about the scandal, her wealth, her downfall. They painted her as a headline, a cautionary tale. But they didn't know her. He did. Not in the way the world had. Not through her reputation or her accomplishments. He had seen her soaked to the bone, shivering on his porch, asking for help. He had seen her laugh softly at his daughter's silly jokes. He had seen her cry silently when she thought no one was watching. That was the woman he knew, not the CEO they were tearing apart on television. The letter stayed on his nightstand. The photo was placed gently in a small frame, right next to his daughter's bed. She looked at it every night before she went to sleep, her little fingers tracing the woman's smile. "She looks happy here," she whispered one evening. "She was," he said softly, his voice thick. His daughter nodded. "We made her happy." Her words struck him deeply. They had made her happy. Even if it was for just one night, they had given her something she hadn't felt in years, a safe place. The following weekend, he found himself driving into the city. He didn't have a plan, but something inside him said he needed to go. The streets were busy, the buildings towering above him. But when he reached her apartment building, it was eerily quiet. People passed by without a second glance, unaware that someone extraordinary had lived and died up there. There were flowers at the entrance. A few candles flickered in the wind. He placed a single white rose down and stood there in silence, his hands in his pockets, his heart heavy. He thought about knocking on that apartment door, but it wasn't hers anymore. She was gone. Back home. He tried to explain things to his daughter as gently as he could. "Sweetheart," he said one night, tucking her in. She was very sad. Even though she smiled with us, she had a lot of pain in her heart. Sometimes people carry so much pain that they feel like they can't go on. His daughter's big eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't she tell us?" He swallowed hard. Maybe she didn't want us to worry. Maybe she just wanted us to see her happy, even for a little while. The little girl sniffled and clutched her stuffed bear. "I wish I told her I loved her." He hugged her tightly. "She knew," he whispered. "I think that's why she wrote us that letter. Because we gave her love when she needed it most." That night, after his daughter fell asleep, he sat alone in the living room, staring at the rain-streaked window. The sound of the storm outside reminded him of that night. Her knock on the door, her trembling voice, the way she had looked at him when he offered her a blanket. She had been a stranger then, but now she felt like someone they'd known forever. He thought about the things she'd said, the loneliness, the weight of her responsibilities, the way she'd smiled at his daughter, as if she was looking at a life she'd never had. He thought about her letter, the way she'd written, "Thank you for making me feel safe." And he cried, not just because she was gone, but because the world would never know her the way they had. To everyone else, she was just a headline. To him, she was a woman who had found peace for one brief night in a warm house with pancakes in the morning, and a little girl who hugged her without judgment. Weeks passed, but the memory of her lingered. Her photo stayed on the fridge, and his daughter often talked about her. "She's in heaven now," she said one day while coloring at the kitchen table. "But I think she's watching us." He smiled faintly. "I think so too." Spring came, and with it a little more light. But he never forgot her. On rainy nights, when thunder rolled across the sky, he would stand at the window, remembering that night she'd knocked on his door. And every time, he felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness that her story ended the way it did, but gratitude that he'd been given the chance to be there for her, even if only for a short time. One evening, months later, he found himself reading her letter again. The handwriting was still neat, though slightly smudged from the tears he'd shed over it. He traced the words with his thumb, his heart aching. "Thank you for that night. It was the first time in years I felt safe. Safe. That was what she needed. And somehow, he and his daughter had given that to her. He decided then that he wouldn't let her memory fade into just another headline. He started telling his daughter stories about her, not about the scandal or the company, but about the way she'd smiled when she tasted their pancakes, the way she'd sat on the floor coloring like a child again, the way she'd whispered thank you at the doorway of their guest room. She was kind, he told his daughter one night. And she was brave. She was just tired. Sometimes people get so tired, they forget how much they're worth. His daughter hugged him tightly. Then we'll remember for her, she said softly. He kissed the top of her head, tears stinging his eyes. Yes, sweetheart, we will. And so they did. Every year, when the rainy season came, they would light a candle by the window and tell stories about the woman who had come to them in a storm. The little girl would show the crayon drawing she'd made that morning, the one the woman had promised to keep forever, and he would show her the photo she had left behind. Together, they would remember her not as the headlines had, but as the woman who had found peace, if only for a night, in a warm house with two strangers who became something like family. And every time thunder rumbled in the distance, he would close his eyes and whisper a silent prayer for her, hoping she had finally found the safety and rest she had been searching for all along. Because sometimes the people who seem the strongest are the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. And sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, one open door, to change the way someone feels, even if only for a moment. He would never forget her, and neither would his daughter.